we're in a battle for cultural transformation. And some places, some political systems, perhaps even our own here in the United States, are going to go one way if they don't start to embrace a more expansive view of the community and the citizens living in it, transparency, the enhancement, the innovation of democracy. And others will do what intelligent communities are doing around the world, which will be prosper and flourish. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to The Intelligent Community, the podcast of the Intelligent Community Movement. I'm Lou Zaccarella, a founder of the Intelligent Community Forum. This special podcast series, The Moment of Truth, From Smart to Intelligent, is brought to you by the members of the Intelligent Community Forum and by the city of Dublin, Ohio, the host of the 2022 ICF Summit on October 26th and 27th. Our summit theme this year is The Future of the Connected Community, and we will be taking a look at the Intelligent Ohio Project and much more as the first attempt to transform an entire state into a connected economic development and innovation engine. You can find out more about attending this event at icfsummit.com. You know, the connected future and the innovation ecosystem is a very good lead-in to my guest in today's discussion. Way back in 2003, I had the privilege of meeting the department chair and the professor of technology management and the director of the Institute for Technology and Enterprise at New York University's Polytechnic School, now the Tandon School of Engineering at NYU. And in a far-ranging conversation, which we always have, I explained to him what the Intelligent Community Forum was about. And I mentioned to him that our conference needed a home in New York, where we wanted to bring the world each year and have a discussion about intelligent communities, innovation, and how we can make the places that people call home better. And without missing a beat, Professor Mel Horwitch invited us to New York University's Polytechnic School to have that conference every year. And we did it for many, many years. And if it weren't for him and for his thinking on innovation, the Intelligent Community Forum would probably still be at the ground zero. So he has done us a great service. He brought the world to New York. And so I was delighted when he accepted my invitation to come here today to speak on the Intelligent Community Forum's podcast, and specifically our Moment of Truth series, which is one that allows us to explore when cities and communities have reached that point where they move from smart to intelligent. So we'll explore that a little bit. But Mel Horwitch is a visiting scholar at the MIT Sloan School of Management. He has a 23-page bio. It's like a book, but much of it is related to topics surrounding innovation and management and making the world better through digital transformation. I'm going to go through it quickly. He was formerly a university professor at Central European University, the dean of their business school, and part of their innovation and entrepreneurship project in Hungary. He's published and taught extensively on technology strategy, global innovation, modern entrepreneurship, most recently with regard to analytics, data science, and emerging economy opportunities. He has also served on the MIT Sloan School, Harvard Business School faculties. He was a visiting scholar at many universities, both here in the United States on the West Coast, in Tokyo. He was a visiting professor at London's Business School and founding dean and professor of management at Theseus Institute in Sophia Antipolis, France, which was one of the early pioneers of the intelligent community movement. He received degrees from Princeton University, a doctorate from Harvard Business School, and one of the things he's most proud of is that he served as a United States Peace Corps volunteer in Thailand in his younger days. He's one of my heroes, actually, and I know I'm going to embarrass him by saying that, but he's back with us today. Mel, it's Professor Horwitch. I'll call you Professor Horwitch first. It's great to see you. Welcome to the Intelligent Community.
Well, Lou, how could I refuse you especially after that intro? And I think you're overly generous in your praise of my impact on ICF. I recognized when you first invited me to give that talk at a hotel near the World Financial Center, as I remember, you were doing something terrific there. I recognized that there was a spark, more than a spark, of something very important you were saying about cities and their role in a more intelligent world, even at that time. And I was just being selfish. I wasn't being generous with you when I suggest, hey, I was just being parasitic. I said, why don't we join in a partnership? And if I could offer you a place to hold this impressive conference, annual summit meeting that you had at what was then Polytechnic University. It later was NYU Poly and then became the Tandon School, as you mentioned. Yeah. All the power to it. And I just look good among my colleagues at the university. So it was a completely selfish, instrumental move in my part.
Okay, well, parasitic is the last thing I'd call you, but it became iconic. And as I said, it really led to what John and Robert and I had really intended to do. I mean, you were kind of like the fourth Beatle there, because we wanted to have this global dialogue, a serious global dialogue about how we can transform cities. And it was the logical place to be for us because of you and the work that you've done. So Mel, what I thought we'd do today is kind of update where we've come in 2 decades, because your work has continued, as has ours. But you've really gone into some really interesting areas. I know you just returned from the PICMET conference here in the United States, where the theme was technology management and leadership in digital transformation. And I think the goal there was to look ahead as we get out of the post-COVID era. And I know you gave a keynote that dealt with what you always characterize as a quest for a more strategic society.
Yeah.
So fill us in a little bit about the notion of the strategic society, and how's that concept related to digital transformation in cities?
Yes, well, I'd be happy to do so in a nutshell, very briefly. As you know, as you mentioned, I was a professor at Central European University in Budapest, which was founded by George Soros. And one of its missions is to further what Soros and others have called the open society. Soros studied under Karl Popper at the London School of Economics in his early years, who developed this concept. And so I began to wonder, what's the role of a business school at a university devoted to open society and democracy and freedom of the press and all that? And that got me thinking about, what are the concepts that I know about in management and business schools and innovation that may apply to society, open society or whatever? And I began to notice terms like open society, smart society, innovative society, entrepreneurial society. And I said, those are very, very important. But I think a society, I think it's different, because you can't, some countries and city states and so on are very, very good and function for their citizens, but I wouldn't say they're necessarily completely democratic. Singapore is a good example of a well-run, highly respected place, but it's not Scandinavia, for example. And so I thought,
politically, you mean in terms of the political structure, yeah.
Yeah, politically, but very, very important country, very impressive place. And so then I said, well, maybe you need to think about a society that thinks strategically about issues and what are the ingredients that make it effective. And I then thought, and I sort of borrowed from management and other areas, and I thought, well, what are the elements that make a society strategic so they can deal with issues, longer term and short term, and they're sort of ingredients that you have to balance off. One of them would be, you need the support of citizens, you need some democracy, you need openness, you need to discuss different issues, that's true. But you also need innovation and entrepreneurship to improve and progress and be resilient, to think about things differently. You also need technology itself, including digital technology. You need to utilize all these new ideas and capabilities in AI, machine learning, digital transformation, because these issues are so complex and we have methodologies. So you need what I call professionalism, project management, strategic planning. But at the same time, I also think you need good judgments. You need instinct, you need leadership, not just rational thinking, but the ability to galvanize people, to lead them. And that's not something that can be put in the code. So you need, and finally, I guess you need the ability to somehow balance and integrate all these disparate factors in a way that can deal with the problems that we face. And in some cultures, you might emphasize different components, and in other cultures, you may emphasize other components because of their values, historical background, and geopolitical position, and so on. But you need all of these sort of in play. And then if you do this effectively, at least you have a quest for a strategic society. It's not strategic society with a capital S, but it's the sort of quest for it that makes you do a better job, that enables you to do a better job to deal with these big issues that we face. Right. And that's what I meant. So it's more of a quest than it is ever reaching an end goal.
Right. Right.
If that makes sense to you.
Well, it does, because you've effectively described the intelligent community, the attempt, as you say, it's a quest.
Yeah, let me
because Mel, it's asking a lot to do all of the things that you just described, because you're talking about the smart stuff, digital transformation, which infers artificial intelligence, IoT, all of those components, but you also brought in things like judgment,
exactly.
the human consideration, the ability to problem solve.
Which you have always emphasized in the discussions we've had. And I want to make a point about ICF in my thinking, because I want to acknowledge it up front. Part of my thinking, and indeed in a paper I used at the same conference, a different paper than the keynote, I mentioned ICF and its selection of the top 7 to show how this idea was something that had been formed, had been gestating for a long time, and you guys were at the beginning of it, and I think it's important, and it certainly informed my thinking a great deal in our discussions that as well.
Yeah. The paper was entitled, is that the one, Macro Innovation 2.0?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, well, the subtitle was, I'm looking at it, The Rebirth of Large Scale Innovation. 2 questions here, Mel. Offline, we were talking about the vaccines that were developed for COVID, and I think you referred to that as an example, perhaps, of large scale innovation. The other question, though, is it brings it back to cities. With our summit coming up, we always, ask you and others who are influential in our movement, what does that large scale innovation mean to the CIO of a city? How does he or she sort of think about implementing all of the elements that you just described earlier? So that's kind of a 2-part question.
Sure. Well, in the paper you referred to, where I talk about let me step back and then I'll answer, if I can, I'll answer your question. Mm-hmm. In the paper, I refer to Macro Innovation 2.0 on purpose, because there was an earlier form of large-scale activities, large-scale projects and programs that we had in the 50s, 60s, and the 70s. These were aerospace programs, defense, like the Polaris missile program, like the Apollo program, like the beginning of the federal interstate highway system in the 50s under President Eisenhower. All these programs were big, important, high priority, but they were kind of finite. They were physical. They were relatively easy to define. They had a beginning, middle, and end. And we developed tools to manage these big endeavors, project management being, and systems analysis being the ones that really NASA and the Defense Department developed at that time. And they were very effective, but they kind of fell by the wayside with the first energy crisis and our attention to R&D and high-tech entrepreneurialism. So large scale was set aside. And then at some point, really at the beginning of the century, at the beginning of your program and others, we began to see that you needed multi-sector activities, public, private, big company, small company, state, local, federal, global, all coming together to deal with big, important issues again. Like, what do we do about cities? What do we do about competitiveness? What do we do about, what do we do about health would be another example. And that's what I call macro innovation 2.0. But it turns out that this is a different creature than the other big endeavors. These are much more open-ended. They don't really end, they keep on going. They don't have the Cold War to protect, they don't have a Cold War shield to protect these big projects like NASA did with Apollo or our defense systems. You know, you have to defend them in their merits, you have to defend them economically, you have to defend them as what they do for the citizens of a city in a way that you didn't before, when you could say, oh, we needed Apollo because the Russians would be first in the moon.
Right.
Okay, yeah. So, and the other thing about these are what I would call softer in the sense that how do you define success? It's much more difficult to define success. It's not simply landing someone on the moon. It's not simply developing a weapon system. When do you know a city is successful? When do you know that you really conquered a disease? Right? Or the vaccine. Right. You never know. And the target seems to, just the hurdle goes higher as time goes on. So this becomes very important. And so how you manage it, what you do is a much more challenging situation. And therefore, we need these elements that I mentioned before. It's not simply technology and systems and profession. It's also good judgment. And you have to engender the trust of your customers, your citizens, so that they will support you in these things in a way that I don't think was true in the earlier, with the predecessors in macro innovation.
Right. And the levels of complexities, as you said, are much more enhanced because you again have to buy a citizen's trust, which we've talked about in the last couple of episodes with people. That always seems to come up, Mel, the word trust. And you're so right. The previous macro projects, I mean, people forget that we went to the moon because there was a war on with the Russians, effectively.
It was a Cold War phenomenon.
Right, really. But nobody cares as much today whether Riverside, California, or 2012 Intelligent Community of the Year beats the Russians to picking up garbage more efficiently, even though in many ways it's as important, isn't it?
Right. Riverside might be a rival to a small city in Russia or China, but it's not that important anymore.
Right.
Exactly.
And citizens don't engage that way. So you need a different method of informing them as to why the investments in innovation are important, if I'm hearing you correctly.
So you ask about the role of the CIO, city, or what maybe the CDO, Chief Data Officer now, not just the CIO. And I think the problem with framing it like that, it relates to what I said before. It's not a technology question. It's not simply having interconnectedness and having everybody on broadband anymore. It's not simply a CIO in the earlier definition of what the role and responsibilities of a CIO are. Now you need to make sure that your citizens understand and support the endeavor, not simply technologically, but as a matter of trust and politically, and also from the point of view of social purpose, right? So will the CIO expand the definition of his or her responsibility to include these non-technical factors or not? Or maybe that's the role of the manager of the whole thing, the mayor or city manager or city council, as well as the CIO or the CDO.
Right.
And all the CIOs that I know in companies, many of them, by the way, are not even technical, but they're good, capable managers who rise to this occasion have a broader look at what their role is.
Right, and they continuously add innovation to their CV or to their list of skills. As a matter of fact, you even see, speaking of Riverside, I think Steve Reniker, when he was the CIO out there, when they made the run to the Intelligent Community of the Year, actually had the title that evolved from Chief Information Officer to Chief Innovation Officer.
That's very interesting. Exactly. I know several people who have CIO-like positions in big companies, very effective companies. And they will tell you that the least of their problems, certainly they have to understand new technologies coming down the pike. And so they put into place machine learning, AI, but their real role is making sure that the non-technical people understand the importance of these technologies and are able to use it in non-technical areas like marketing and so on, strategy making and things like that.
Economic development.
An enormous amount of their time speaking to people, having one-on-one meetings with people throughout the organization, selling different kind of technology initiatives they have underway. And so human and person-to-person communication here and trust becomes very important, even within a firm. Now, if you go out and you talk about a city where by definition you have a huge diversity of constituencies, all of whom have different kinds of priorities, the problem becomes exacerbated, becomes even a greater challenge. So you really have to have this ability to speak to different groups, make them understand how it is in their interest, how it helps them to have these technologies in play, working for their benefit.
Yeah. And, I want to get to your sort of big insight when it came to our understanding of your work, because at the end of the day, we're in a battle for cultural transformation. And some places, some political systems, perhaps even our own here in the United States, are going to go one way if they don't start to embrace a more expansive view of the community and the citizens living in it, transparency, the enhancement, the innovation of democracy. And others will do what intelligent communities are doing around the world, which will be prosper and flourish. So we talk about light and dark. I mean, it's that stark with regard to the cultural transformation being promulgated by this, quote, digital transformation. You originated the concept, which is still with us 20 years later, about the flipping point city. And for us, that really opened our eyes, because it just put in the starkest terms, the most poetic terms, where we were with regard to our cities and our cultures. We were at a point where if we didn't embrace some of the things that we've been talking about to here, at least it was our belief, that cities would go backwards, and cities and communities can go backwards. We never assumed that. We always assumed that because it's 2023, it's going to be better than it was in 2013. And you always said, no, not true at all. I mean, just read your history. So I want to ask you, first of all, maybe explain a little bit what you meant by flipping point cities when you originally evolved this concept, and where do you think we are today? What is the moment of truth for a city today, Mel?
Well, whenever I developed this idea a couple decades ago now, it seems like a different era, different universe to some extent. I always thought that what you needed to put in place was enough critical mass of technology, of connectedness, of officials who sort of understood this. And at some point it would be obvious that you can't manage a city government, you can't manage the libraries, you can't manage traffic systems, you can't manage education, you can't manage whatever makes a city garbage, collecting garbage, unless you had these technologies in place and people would see that. And then you also had vendors that would be able to help cities in carrying that out. And you're right, this was sort of an optimistic technological way to think about things. And I now understand, and who could have predicted this that we live in a world which is much more complex, much more pushback to some extent. And, there's a lot of suspicion about technology, and there's a lot of suspicion about the people who might be the leaders, champions of it, and so on. So I think you still have a kind of a flipping point, but the critical mass is very different today, Lou. In some ways, the easy part, I think, is technology.
Yeah.
The easy part is technology. Broadband is relatively cheap today, and we can put it in the place. We don't even have to hardwire it. It can go through the air, in a way. So, and there are lots of companies that will do it effectively. And we know how to do it in private firms, and we know how to do it in cities. So the whole smart city, I'm not talking about the intelligent community movement, but the smart city movement is supported by industry. And when I sort of looked at this when I was developing this idea of strategic society. Smart society is something that a lot of firms say when they're selling their products right now. And you look at the websites of all these firms, but we find out that that's no longer enough. That what you have to have in play is selling the fact that this kind of capability will help communities and citizens in their daily lives and in their families and their children being educated. And that is not a technical problem. That's a matter of trust. It's more than a matter of trust. It is in their interest in order for their kids to have better jobs, a better future. And this goes back to something that, you and I have discussed with innovation a bit. And that is, there's what I call and this goes back to a little bit the concept of open society circa 21st century, second decade, 21st century. And that is, there's a moral dimension to this.
Yeah.
A moral dimension that people, if they don't have the ability to improve, if they don't have the ability to learn, access to knowledge, if they don't have the ability to interact with each other in a high level way and in a real time way, or in a long-term and short-term way, what does that mean for citizens and human beings, whether it's in a city in the United States or in Africa or someplace else? I think it's almost a right to develop people to their capability and to at least give them that opportunity. It's almost a right. And therefore, what we need to explain to people is that by developing what you would call intelligent communities or a strategic society, you have that right, and this is the only way we can progress for you and your family, not simply in a professional sense, but also just living meaningful lives.
Yes.
And there's a moral dimension. So, I think this is extremely, and I don't think this has been explained very well. And I think the places that do this well, the cities that do this well in their own way, have reached a kind of bargain with their communities and citizens. They say, they may not even articulate this, or they say, okay, we'll go along with this. We support it because we see that you somehow respect us as people with potential.
Right.
And therefore, we know you're trying. We may not, there may be better ways to, we know you're trying. And we support you in this. And also leaders go on, they say, how can you help us out? Can we do a better job? That's what I think needs to be done to complement the technology.
I mean, yeah, again, Mel, that's a very great and deep insight. When you start talking about the moral dimension and add it to the critical mass that you refer to, now you start to get into a range of possible solutions or next level stuff for the intelligent community movement. Because again, this doesn't happen in a vacuum. You don't get touched by an angel and all of a sudden become moral. We know it doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that for an individual nor a society. So I have to ask you, because you and I both spent a lot of time in Asia. I go to Vietnam, and Vietnam has become very, very embracing of the intelligent community concept. The Dutch, our friends in Eindhoven, have been over there mentoring them for years. I know you in the long ago said you got to look at Vietnam. They're doing some interesting stuff over there. Now, when we talk about your moral dimension of this, Vietnam seems to me to fit a lot of those criteria. They have a collective notion that they're headed in the right direction. They're embracing what they're being told by their government. They're starting to put the pieces in place. Bin Dong is a great experiment, an example of that. We're seeing young people, like some of our colleagues over there now who are leading the intelligent community movement over there, coming home from teaching at the Sorbonne, from living in France, living in California, living in Singapore even, coming home because there's this belief that some dimension has opened up in that country that is going to drive much of the things that you've been talking about, where we see it flourishing. But here's my question on the moral side of this. They're a communist country.
Yeah.
They're a one-party state. They are not in any way that we would define it here in the West, a democracy. Can there be a moral dimension that's fulfilling within the structure and the government that they have bought into or that's been sold to them?
Well, I think let's just step back. I'm not trying to avoid the question, but let's step back.
No, that's fine.
The successes that we have seen so far in the world in the area of strategic society or ICF, intelligent community, have basically been relatively small places. We can think of them, we can think of Estonia, Finland, we can think of Eindhoven, you mentioned, and we can think of Singapore, we can think of certain cities in the United States, smaller cities. But so there's an element of scale that I've been wondering about. What happens when you get to bigger countries, right? I mean, it seems to work when they're sort of tidy sizes and you can then take all the dimensions and put it together. But what happens when you get to, say, a medium-sized country or a large country? Vietnam, what is 80 million people in it or something like that, and or other countries, let alone big countries like the United States, Brazil, Russia, and so on. And I think that's a challenge. And I thought of Vietnam, it even occurred to me to think of Vietnam as a kind of a testing ground for whether this can be pulled off as a country as opposed to certain cities within that country.
Interesting.
And I think there's a lot going for it. It is a country that has a vision for itself that it wants to become an advanced country, or at least to improve. It's a hardworking country, as you know.
Oh yeah.
They have growth, and it's been successful. They're very committed to education. And I think that they're open to help from all over the world, including the United States. And of course, they have a strong relationship with Singapore and other places to invest. So I think Vietnam is a very good place to invest one's time in developing the kind of capabilities that we're discussing. And when I think about the notion of strategic society, and there's that one part about how open, how democratic you have to be. Yeah. Well, you don't have to be, as I said, in Western Europe. You have to be open enough to get new ideas and to welcome new ideas.
Right.
And you have to be open enough to accept people who, in your own country, who have new innovative ideas.
I see.
And therefore, it's a question of not squashing those ideas. Now, how a country does that, given its own history and culture and political system, is something very, very complex that an American parachuted in may not understand.
Yeah.
But I do think there's a modicum of openness, of tolerance of differences that you need to be successful in becoming what you would call an intelligent community, what I call a strategic society. And without that, you get stagnant and stale, and you live off your perceived successes up to now. And so therefore, this is the challenge, I think, that systems such as have to face. How can they allow these enough differences to emerge and willingness of people to express them so that out of this you get the best ideas and you compete for the best ideas?
Yeah. So obviously, to simplify it, as I'm only capable of doing, they have to have a willingness to say yes before they say no to something. But it brings to mind that famous quote by our former senator in New York many years ago, and I like to refer to him often, Senator Moynihan, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was also a scholar, politician, sort of the ultimate Renaissance man. And he was referring one time to, at that time, the Soviet Union, always trying to steal American technology secrets. And he said, look, we've got to defend ourselves, obviously, and do it rigorously. But they forget something, that technology is a system. It's not a secret. And of course, that would feed right into what you were just saying. There is a culture that has to evolve, an intelligent culture, to create the kinds of innovations that we need to move forward. And we didn't quite answer the question, Mel, about whether that is a moral dimension, whether being open is a moral dimension or whether it's just self-serving to a society.
Well,
maybe that's another discussion. Maybe we don't want to take it on now. It's both. It's both.
Maybe I mentioned I spent a month teaching in Hanoi.
Yeah.
I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, whenever it was. And it was an executive MBA program in the evening to a bunch of Vietnamese executives in different companies. And we meet, and I taught this course on global strategy and innovation, and it was great. We had the same kind of discussion we would have in New York or Boston or Paris, and it was great. And then we did these capstone projects where the students went off and they developed innovation strategies for different Vietnamese companies, and how they could expand and so on. And some of them did expand later, and they were absolutely brilliant. It turns on people. And they become alive. They become spirited.
Exactly.
There's something about what you're communicating to them is that you not only trust them, you respect them. You think they have something to offer, and you trying to figure out, and please tell us what it is. And this is the human spirit, right? This is something that happens when you have that spark. And this was in Hanoi, the capital of Vietnam, right? And we had a great discussion on innovation and companies. Now, it's not like managing cities and so on, but I think the same thing is true in a city or even a state or a country, that you don't have to start from your own political ideals. You start with whatever seems important for people, as long as it opens things up a bit, so that
as long as you know who you are culturally, right, you're secure.
Yeah,
I mean, that's what you're saying, and you're right. The thing about Vietnam is, we've been doing this a long time. Sometimes you can get a little stale or feel a little stale, but I came back from there in June. We did our top 7 announcement there, as everyone knows probably. And I got fired up. I got reinvigorated just by their levels of enthusiasm. And I'm like, there's the Calabrian in me, the skeptic. And I'm like, gee, maybe Hanoi at some point will think this is not a great idea. And are we going to get this all shut down? I don't know. Who knows? But boy, to your point, the level of enthusiasm and the belief that they're moving in the right direction, and the willingness to have those discussions. I mean, we've had some pretty tough discussions about things that are beyond technology with some of the leadership there, is encouraging. And you may be right to your point that there's a right sizing for an intelligent community. The small to mid-sized community may be the player over the next 50 years that gets a lot of the things done that we need to do. Mel, we've always talked also, and you alluded to it earlier, about this need to go from smart to intelligent. Now, there are a lot of differing views on what that means today. Most people still can't define intelligent community. They still think of smart communities, which has been co-opted by the corporate class for obvious reasons. There's a lot of business opportunity there, right? And it's great for the growth of companies, great for shareholders, great for the society at large when you can implement this stuff. But it's not the intelligent notion that we've been talking about today. In your view, what is the best way to understand the transformation from smart to intelligent? How do you teach that?
Well, I think first of all, the insight that you had from the very beginning, you used the adjective intelligent rather than smart, and intelligent rather than innovative was insightful, because it broadens the discussion. To be intelligent is not necessarily just to have a lot of data or even information or even knowledge. It's how you apply it and use it for a variety of purposes, particularly if you're in the public sector, purposes that serve different constituencies and are somewhat long-term, not just short-term. So I think intelligent is, and this gets back to the idea of strategic, is a capacity to understand in real time now what you have to do in the present to make a community function. The basic hygienic things, right? Whether it's, as I said, traffic, garbage, just the city services that need to work, but also a capacity to anticipate and recognize problems that come up in the medium term or long term. And this is very, very difficult in politics to do, because we're so busy reacting to immediate problems that are in the newspaper and get the attention of people, and people have strong views on that. How do you deal with medium term or longer term issues that don't yet have the force of immediate concerns? And so I think an intelligent community somehow is able to put on its radar medium and longer term problems, and is able to provide a way to monitor and offer solutions or quasi solutions. And the cities that you have identified as being role models, exemplars of this, have the capacity to think a little bit ahead, or more than a little bit ahead, in putting together policies in place to prepare them for either opportunities or challenges that we face. And so, I remember looking at some of these cities. Thailand is a good example. Remember when Thailand won in one year? And it was just a good example of how they put into place all these different systems to help. And of course, they were right across from Finland, which helped a lot in kind of a symbiotic relationship. But there are other cities. Eindhoven, you mentioned, is another. And probably the cities that you were just at in Vietnam is another example of thinking a little bit ahead and saying, we got to prepare. So I think it's this ability to have the radar, not just in real time, but in the future, that is and be able to convince your community that we have to invest resources, modern resources, to look at this.
Right. Just the last question, Mel. We could go on forever here, and I want to revisit that moral dimension element in another conversation, but I know you got to run to another event. But are you as bullish on technology management's promise to transform communities as you were when we first sat down near the 55 Broad Street in the old days to talk about the intelligent communities? Or because I sense that you've gone through some evolution, that you certainly aren't standing still. You've sort of broadened your view, but are you still bullish on technology management as the way out?
Well, I'm not bullish on technologists leading the charge. I'm not even bullish on just CIOs leading the charge, although there were. I think that there needs to be a broader sort of understanding of why we need these new capabilities by generalists or by people outside of technology, by people who represent citizen groups, who are part of the, political process, who, and in that sense, on the one hand, you see that now, you see many leaders that understand the need to, use technology and have that capability. In the paper on macro innovation, I talk about what making cities better is one example, having a national AI strategy as another example. We could talk about the vaccine development as another example. So there is this recognition, this understanding, but at the same time, I think that there's a pushback if it's just technological. If they see it's being done by a small group of specialists, elitists, it needs to be sold in a way that is meaningful, as I said before, to citizens themselves. And so I don't think this is necessarily a trajectory going forward, positive. There's now, as we've seen with vaccines, there's pushback to this for a variety of, as it sort of represents different kind of political views. So we have to find a better way to say how this can be useful and trusted and not a threat to people.
Yes.
Privacy is important. How far do you go with some of the capabilities? We could go on and talk about these things for a long time.
Right.
So I think I think this is a big challenge right now, Lou.
Yeah, I hear you, Mel. And what I also hear is there's a need to sort of continue to reach out to the citizen and just, again, to borrow a poetic phrase, to touch the humanity of a person and to have them believing again about the idea and the power of community and what it means to be in an open society.
Yes.
And we still got a lot of work to do.
Yeah. I think that we need to lower the decibel and the emotion of this and explain to people why this is important in various ways. And by signaling that, we're showing we want a dialogue with people, that we sort of respect their ability to think through these. They may disagree, but take it out of the realm of emotion and extremism as much as we can, and into problem solving, having people understand how this is a threat to their families and communities if we don't do something.
Right.
And this is difficult, but as you've seen communities that do this pretty well.
Yes.
You reward these communities, right?
It's possible.
Yeah. And I think in all your communities, it's not technological now recently. Because your criteria is much broader than technology.
Right. Yeah. And again, we're trying to go even broader. We're looking at Ohio as the intelligent state now, because Dublin has said, hey, we want to inform the rest of the state as to what's been going on here and to see if we can become more like Taiwan, where, they declared years ago that they were going to have a cluster of intelligent communities to create an intelligent island. And that has informed so much.
Taiwan's a very good example because it's not just a city state like Singapore and so on. It's a small, medium-sized country of 20 million people, and they've been able to actually accomplish this, right?
Exactly.
To actually reach this level. And so now, how do you go from 5 million to 20 million to 80 million?
Right.
So.
Right. Well, as we've been saying for the last 20 years, you do it one city at a time, and you hope that this becomes like a virus that doesn't need a vaccine. This one that just keeps spreading. And Mel, you've been such an inspirational and important part of our thinking around this subject for 2 decades. I can't thank you enough for that. And thanks for coming by and doing this today. I want to do another one.
Well, I'm honored and the feeling's mutual, Lou.
That concludes my conversation with Professor Mel Horwitch. To learn more about his work and the MIT Sloan School, visit mitsloan.mit.edu. And if you want more information about Professor Horwitch, his writings and his works, contact us at the Intelligent Community Forum and we'll send it along. You can meet interesting people like Professor Horwitch and learn from regions, cities, and towns across the world on October 26th when the ICF Summit returns to a live venue. That venue will be the amazing city of Dublin, Ohio, a small city, as we were just talking about, and a place which produces more Fortune 1000 companies on a per capita basis than any other place in America. Being in Central Ohio, the base of Intelligent Ohio, will be a learning experience for anyone who attends. For more information on how you can register at no cost, visit icfsummit.com. It's a great place to do business with cities, investors, and others. And there's also a virtual option as well this year. Learn more about the ICF method for helping cities thrive by following us on Facebook and Twitter at New Communities, or you can follow me at Lou ICF. For the Intelligent Community podcast and our producer, Ori Yates, who has successfully produced her first segment of the Intelligent Community, I'm Lou Zaccarella, reminding you that there really is no place like home. Take care, everybody. Thanks for coming in.